This is the man Raleigh police arrested and charged with felony burglary and murder in the death of a local private school teacher. His name is Ryan Camacho, and he's 36 years old. Here at Ravenscroft School in North Raleigh. This is where Zoe Welsh served as the chair of the upper school science department. Sadly and tragically, she died after Raleigh police say Camacho broke into her home this morning. According to Raleigh police, Welsh called 911 just after 6:30 this morning to report.
At a quiet residence in Raleigh, a phone call reached emergency dispatch just before the line went silent. What followed would expose a sequence of events stretching far beyond a single address or a single night. The case would soon involve a school community, a defendant with a long paper trail, and a series of decisions made months earlier in courtrooms few people were watching. Public attention initially focused on what happened inside the home, but the deeper story unfolded elsewhere, in prior arrests, sealed evaluations, and routine legal agreements that carried lasting consequences. As details emerged, the focus shifted from the act itself to the systems surrounding it. This is not only the account of a killing, but of warnings documented, risks assessed, and choices approved. Understanding how these elements align requires going back well before police arrived at the scene. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The killing of Zoe Welsh in early January 2026 became a national story not solely because of the act itself, but because of the sequence of institutional decisions that preceded it. What initially appeared to be a residential homicide soon revealed layers involving prior criminal records, mental health evaluations, prosecutorial discretion, and judicial outcomes. As details emerged, the case began to represent a broader intersection of violent crime and systemic oversight. The case drew national attention due to the suspect's documented history with the criminal justice system and the timing of his release from custody months before the incident. Media coverage expanded beyond the crime scene to focus on plea agreements, court filings, and the processes that allowed an individual with repeated arrests to remain in the community. Public discussion increasingly centered on how risk is assessed and managed within existing systems. Three central questions guide examination of this case. First, who was the victim beyond the initial headlines and public statements? Second, who was the suspect prior to the crime, and how was his behavior documented over time? Third, what legal, medical, and administrative decisions allowed these two individuals' paths to intersect? Addressing these questions requires a detailed review of personal background, timeline reconstruction, and institutional decision-making, as well as acknowledgement of unresolved issues that remain part of the ongoing legal process. Zoe Welsh was raised in North Carolina and followed a structured academic path that led her into education. From early life, records and accounts indicate a focus on academic achievement, particularly in science-related subjects. She pursued higher education with the intent of entering the teaching profession, completing the credentials required for secondary-level instruction. Her career as a science teacher developed steadily. Welsh was known for a methodical teaching style that emphasized structured experimentation, clear benchmarks, and consistent assessment. Colleagues described her classroom approach as organized and curriculum-focused, with attention to long-term student progress rather than short-term outcomes. She maintained professional boundaries and adhered closely to institutional guidelines. At Ravenscroft School, a private institution in Raleigh, Welsh held a full-time teaching position. Her role included classroom instruction and participation in departmental planning. She was involved in extracurricular academic activities related to science education, including mentoring and curriculum development initiatives. Within the school community, she was regarded as reliable and consistent in her responsibilities. Welsh lived alone in a residential neighborhood. Her daily routines were stable, typically involving workdays structured around school hours and evenings spent at home. Her social circles were relatively limited and centered primarily around professional colleagues and a small number of personal contacts. There were no publicly reported disputes or significant disruptions in her personal life in the months leading up to the incident. In the period before January 2026, no major changes to her schedule or behavior were documented. She had future plans related to continued professional development and long-term teaching goals. Following her death, public perception often reduced her identity to her profession and the circumstances of the crime, overlooking the structured, routine-driven nature of her life prior to the incident. Raleigh, North Carolina is a growing metropolitan area with mixed residential and commercial zones. The neighborhood where the crime occurred is characterized by single-family homes, moderate traffic, and a relatively low rate of violent crime compared to urban centers. Prior incidents in the area largely involved property-related offenses rather than violent acts. Welsh's home was a standalone residence situated within a quiet block. The layout included multiple entry points, typical of similar homes in the area. Publicly available information indicates no advanced security system, such as monitored alarms or surveillance cameras, beyond standard locks. The time frame of early January 2026 placed the incident during winter, when daylight hours are shorter and evening activity is reduced. Seasonal factors contributed to lower pedestrian presence and minimal outdoor observation during nighttime hours. Neighborhood activity levels were consistent with a residential area at that time of year. On the night of the incident, Welsh was inside her home, engaged in routine activities. At some point, signs of intrusion became apparent. The nature of the intrusion suggested unauthorized entry rather than forced confrontation outside the residence. Welsh contacted emergency services during the incident. Public records confirm that a 911 call was placed and remained active for a short period before ending abruptly. The content of the call has not been fully released, but its existence established a narrow timeline for the events that followed. Emergency dispatch recorded the call and initiated a response. Law enforcement officers were dispatched to the address within minutes. Upon arrival, officers entered the residence and located Welsh inside the home. First responders secured the scene and initiated standard procedures, including medical assessment and scene preservation. Investigators documented physical evidence at the scene, including signs consistent with unlawful entry. The interior of the home showed areas of disturbance, indicating movement through multiple rooms. Some items were displaced, though reports did not immediately indicate a clear motive related to theft. Forensic teams collected fingerprints and biological samples. DNA evidence was processed to identify potential contributors. A weapon was identified in connection with the incident, though details regarding its origin and use were limited in early reporting. Despite evidence collection, investigators noted limitations. The absence of surveillance footage and the lack of witnesses inside the home restricted the ability to reconstruct every movement. The case relied heavily on forensic correlation and subsequent suspect identification. Ryan Camacho became a suspect through a combination of investigative leads. Law enforcement reviewed recent reports of suspicious activity in the area and cross-referenced them with individuals known to have prior arrests nearby. Surveillance footage from surrounding locations placed Camacho in proximity to the neighborhood around the relevant time frame. Camacho had prior interactions with law enforcement in Raleigh and nearby jurisdictions. These interactions included arrests for property-related crimes. Within hours of the incident, police located and arrested Camacho. The arrest occurred without reported resistance at a separate location from the crime scene. Camacho's background includes a history of instability beginning in early adulthood. Educational records indicate incomplete schooling and inconsistent employment. Over time, he accumulated multiple arrests across Wake and Durham counties. His criminal record shows a pattern of offenses including breaking and entering, larceny, and property damage. The severity of charges escalated gradually, with some incidents involving weapons-related allegations. Despite repeated arrests, outcomes often resulted in reduced charges or short sentences. Sentencing patterns reflected a reliance on plea agreements. Geographic concentration of offenses suggested repeated activity within a limited area. These outcomes placed Camacho back in the community multiple times over several years. Court records document that Camacho underwent multiple mental health evaluations. Diagnoses included serious mental illness, and at times, courts declared him incompetent to proceed. His mother was granted guardian status during certain periods, indicating recognized impairment. Despite documented concerns, involuntary commitment was not pursued on several occasions. Decisions reflected legal thresholds that were not met or assessments that favored release. Mental health services and criminal courts operated in parallel rather than in coordination. These interactions illustrate the complexity of managing individuals who cycle between criminal charges and mental health evaluations. The case highlights the limitations of existing mechanisms when risk does not meet statutory criteria for confinement. In 2025, Ryan Camacho faced multiple criminal charges across Wake and Durham counties, most of them related to property crimes. Court records show repeated allegations of breaking and entering, trespassing, and property damage. Some incidents involved occupied residences, while others involved commercial or vacant properties. Although these offenses were not classified as violent felonies at the time, they reflected a consistent pattern of unlawful entry and disregard for property boundaries. Prosecutors ultimately consolidated several pending charges into a plea agreement. Under the terms of that agreement, Camacho pleaded guilty to a reduced offense, reportedly classified as a low-level misdemeanor. In exchange, felony charges were dismissed. The plea deal limited his exposure to prison time and resulted in a short custodial sentence, followed by release. The prosecutorial reasoning, as later explained by the district attorney's office, centered on evidentiary concerns. Prosecutors stated that some cases lacked cooperative witnesses, others relied on circumstantial evidence, and some incidents did not meet the burden required for felony convictions. In such circumstances, plea agreements are commonly used to secure a conviction rather than risk dismissal at trial. The judicial approval process followed standard procedure. A judge reviewed the plea, confirmed that the defendant understood its terms, and determined that the agreement complied with sentencing guidelines. No extraordinary objections were raised during the hearing. The plea was accepted, and the sentence imposed was consistent with similar misdemeanor outcomes in the jurisdiction. Camacho served a limited period in custody and was released months before the killing. At the time, the plea attracted little public attention. After the homicide, however, the agreement became a focal point of scrutiny. Critics questioned whether the charges should have remained felonies and whether the cumulative nature of Camacho's prior offenses warranted a different outcome. Alternatives existed. Prosecutors could have pursued separate trials, sought enhanced sentencing based on prior convictions, or requested additional mental health evaluations before finalizing the plea. Judges could have imposed stricter probation conditions or ordered mandatory treatment. None of these measures were ultimately applied. The case exposed a breakdown between mental health services and the criminal justice system. Court documents indicated that Camacho had a documented history of mental health diagnoses and competency evaluations. At various points, guardianship arrangements were established, suggesting concerns about his ability to manage daily life independently. Despite this history, coordination between mental health providers and the courts appeared inconsistent. Evaluations were conducted, but long-term treatment plans were not enforced. Involuntary commitment was considered, but not ordered. Once Camacho was deemed legally competent, criminal proceedings resumed without parallel mental health oversight. Risk assessment tools used by courts primarily evaluated immediate flight risk and likelihood of court appearance, not long-term danger to the public. Nonviolent charges were treated in isolation rather than as part of a cumulative behavioral pattern. Repeated unlawful entries did not trigger elevated risk classifications. Patterns were present but minimized. Multiple arrests across jurisdictions, escalating frequency of offenses, and prior encounters involving occupied residences suggested increasing risk. However, because individual incidents remained within lower offense categories, the broader trajectory did not result in heightened intervention. Similar cases across the United States show comparable outcomes. Individuals with repeated low-level offenses and untreated mental illness often cycle through the system without sustained intervention until a severe crime occurs. Experts have long noted that this gap represents a structural weakness rather than a failure of any single actor. Legal scholars and mental health professionals emphasize that criminal courts are not designed to function as treatment systems. Without dedicated diversion programs or mandatory coordination mechanisms, individuals like Camacho move between agencies without consistent oversight. Following the killing, Camacho was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and felony burglary. These charges reflected the severity of the alleged conduct and carried the possibility of life imprisonment. A judge denied bond, citing public safety concerns and the nature of the charges. Camacho was remanded to custody, where he remains pending trial. The bond decision marked a significant shift from prior proceedings, where release was routinely granted. Initial court appearances focused on procedural matters, including the appointment of counsel and scheduling of hearings. Defense attorneys signaled that mental health would likely play a role in the case, though no formal insanity defense has been publicly confirmed. The prosecution's preliminary case relies on physical evidence, witness accounts, and recorded emergency calls. Prosecutors have indicated they will argue premeditation based on forced entry and actions at the scene. The legal trajectory includes competency evaluations, evidentiary hearings, and the possibility of a jury trial. Given the seriousness of the charges, the case is expected to extend over several years. Public reaction intensified as details emerged. Community members expressed concern about safety and accountability. The school where the victim worked released statements acknowledging the loss and reviewing internal support procedures. Media coverage followed a predictable pattern. Initial reporting focused on the crime itself, followed by investigative reporting into Camacho's criminal history and the 2025 plea deal. Attention then shifted to systemic questions rather than individual actions alone. Political figures referenced the case in broader discussions about criminal justice reform. Some called for stricter sentencing, while others emphasized mental health investment. Prosecutors and judges issued statements defending their decisions within the constraints of existing law. Several questions remain unresolved. Could the crime have been prevented through earlier intervention? Were warning signs adequately recognized or dismissed as routine? Was the plea deal appropriate given the cumulative history? The case also raises questions about scale. How many similar cases exist without public attention? How often do warning patterns go unaddressed until outcomes escalate? Responsibility appears distributed rather than singular. Prosecutors, judges, legislators, and mental health agencies each operated within defined roles. Yet the outcome suggests limitations in how those roles intersect. The case has influenced policy discussions around plea bargaining, mental health diversion programs, and risk assessment reform. Legislators have referenced the case in debates over funding and statutory authority. Mental health reform advocates point to the need for enforceable treatment pathways. Prosecutorial discretion has come under scrutiny, particularly when repeated low-level offenses accumulate. Public safety concerns remain central, while victim advocacy groups emphasize transparency and prevention rather than reactive measures. As of now, Camacho remains in custody, awaiting further hearings. Competency evaluations and pretrial motions are ongoing. Potential outcomes range from trial verdicts to negotiated resolutions. Regardless of the verdict, institutions involved may face long-term review. Prosecutorial guidelines, judicial discretion, and interagency communication are likely to be reassessed. This case reveals how risk can accumulate unnoticed within routine processes. It demonstrates the limits of systems designed to handle isolated incidents rather than long-term trajectories. The story does not end with a verdict because its implications extend beyond a single courtroom. Documentation, transparency, and systemic evaluation remain central to understanding what occurred and why.